Right, huge welcome to investigative journalist Janine Griffiths with Mind Control, Media and Words of Mass Destruction. We met Janine at a critical mass radio conference in Manchester recently and talked at length. And she introduced us to her website, all the W's, akashictimes.co.uk, which is an online independent newspaper. It's well researched, current and fascinating, and a celebrity-free zone. It contains stories that evade mainstream press, remaining free from the corruption that doesn't. Stories like using African children as vaccine lab rats, insightful health articles, sinister plans by mobile phone providers towards the transhumanist ideal of integrated man and machine. Scary. Courageous whistleblowers and the shocking abuse of power, and a critical eye on war in the Middle East, highlighting rape and chemical weapons. A proper journalist, fearless and honest. Please welcome Janine Griffiths. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Yes, I'm Janine. I'm the founder of Akashic Times. I also edit the paper. And tonight I'm going to be speaking a little bit about mind control, media, and how it's used to negatively influence their perceptions of people, the perception that we have of society. It's basically a tool of divide and conquer. Now, there are a lot of good, hard-working journalists out there, but unfortunately, as I will go into my talk today, they are constrained. They're very limited in the kind of news that they are allowed to publish, and it's very deliberate. And in my talk today, I'll also go through who owns a lot of these, not only the national papers, but also the regional outlets and the student publications as well, even they're not truly independent. So just a little bit of introduction. My reason for setting up the Akashic Times can be summarised into four main objectives. First and foremost, exposing corruption and injustice within and behind our political systems. So what I mean by that is I don't just talk about politics the way it's presented to us on programmes such as Question Time or the news. Now what I do is I go into the corporate influences behind that. The reason why we see so many of the same policies throughout countries in the West. Why is it that they all seem to have the same agenda? Why is it that we're stuck in a two-party system and they're both virtually indistinguishable? I mean, we've got a kind of third party that just tags along, but really it's a two-party system. Another thing I do at the Akashic Times is I inspire people, or try to inspire people to make changes, to make positive changes. You know, the problem with the mainstream media is there's a lot of doom and gloom, and people often feel very helpless. They come away thinking, well, I'm just one person, what can I do in the face of all this war, rising crime, poverty, debt? I mean, that's all we ever seem to hear about nowadays. And when the news is positive, when we do hear something positive, it's usually irrelevant. It's not very empowering. You know, we might hear something about two celebrities getting married, for example, or Victoria Beckham's new shoes, or look at this cute picture of a puppy, or something like that. It's nothing that can really inspire you or motivate you to make a change. Usually, you get a little bit of that, but when you think of the ratio of negative news to positive news, I mean, it's really few and far between. So I tend to feature stories on the Akashic Times about people who really have sort of been a whistleblower, for example, and come out of it well the other end. People who've maybe done something really fantastic in their communities and helped a lot of people, but perhaps don't get given a voice by the mainstream media. And that's something else I do at the Akashic Times. I give a voice to people who may not otherwise have had one. People who, for example, may be sidelined or indeed misrepresented by the mainstream press. I like to give them exposure because I really think we should celebrate people like that in our community. And I feature a lot of alternative health stories on the site as well. A lot of times, a lot of the news and the health advice that we see on the mainstream tends to be sponsored by pharmaceutical interests. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that there is a place, a very small place, I hasten to add, for pharmaceutical medicine. You know, it can help people in certain emergency situations. But we don't hear a lot about the stories of people curing what we're told is incurable conditions, such as diabetes, for example, using alternative health medicines. We don't see a lot of that. And that's something that I do at my site. I go out and interview practitioners who have a proven track record of helping people, a proven track record of curing or healing some of these disastrous conditions that people find themselves in. And I present them to an audience and I let them make their own mind up. So just a little bit of background about me as a journalist. I started out working in the West Midlands. I worked for both local and regional papers in the UK, and that included publications such as the Hereford Journal, the Telford Journal and the Shropshire Sun. And that's the first thing that I came across. All of those publications, plus many more in the region, are owned by the same family. The same family owns about 98% of the publications across the West Midlands, say one or two. So it's, you know, there's no diversity of opinion there, and it's the same throughout the UK. I remember when I started out as a new journalist, applying for jobs, applying for apprenticeships, on the application forms, the same names kept coming up again and again. I currently work in Yorkshire for a news agency called Axel Media, and that's basically corporate journalism. They concentrate on business and finance, and that basically just that puts the food on the table. But after a while, I realised that it wasn't me. It wasn't, you know, I wanted more. You know, I didn't come into journalism for that reason. And so the idea for the Akashic Times was born. And so I started it in January of this year. It's been going ever since. And something that I do at the Akashic Times is I really get other people involved. So I have a lot of other writers and people contributing their opinions and some of the facts that they've found out on my site. And it really does help with diversity of opinion, and that's something that's really... So why else did I set up the Akashic Times? Well, I've had a mistrust of the mainstream media. I've always been taught to be cynical about what I read and the things that I see. But I started out as an idealist, some may say quite naive. I went into the profession thinking, well, I can just change it from within, can't I? And that's what people do, isn't it? You know, they join these industries and they see that things aren't quite right and they just change it. Well, I discovered that things didn't quite work that way. I got my first real taste of reality when working on the Telford Journal. The then Mayor of Telford, his wife, approached our paper and basically told us that he'd been beating her up for quite some time. There was a lot of domestic violence going on. He had also fraudulent business activities, he was embezzling public funds, and she'd actually been to the police and through the court system about this, and she had the documents with her to prove it. I spent months working on this case, putting in Freedom of Information Act requests, building up relationships with some of the key characters that she mentioned in order to build up the story and go live with it. And the day before it was due to go to press, I got called into the editor's office and told, hey, you know, you're a fantastic journalist, we love the energy you put into this, we really like how you researched the facts, we won't be publishing it, but it's a really, really good story. And then they added, but please do make sure you use those skills that you've used for this story, the less controversial articles. And the reason why it was controversial, some of those fraudulent businesses were our paper's biggest advertisers. And there you have the problem right there. And this goes on even down to a local level, and I just realised how censored and how biased the news was. At this point, what do a lot of journalists do? give up or they toe the line. They take the if you can't beat them, join them mentality. Well, for me, I just couldn't do that because journalism isn't something I went in for the money. First of all, there is none. And secondly, I went in because writing was my passion. It was something that I've done from a very early age, talking to people, finding out things. It's something that I love, and it's something that I wasn't willing to just give up on. But the problem with the media is it's not just the fact that they spread disinformation. It's also the fact that they tend to cover things up a lot, cover up important stories, so you only get one side of the picture. The Hillsborough disaster through the Sun newspaper, if you want to call it a newspaper, their coverage, for example, of the Hillsborough disaster, when they falsely claimed that fans were peeing on each other, stealing from the dead, beating up cops, and 20 years later they were forced into a very embarrassing apology. The Sun do this all the time, actually. It's not the first time that they've smeared people. They did this with, I can't remember it too well off the top of my head, but it was a case where 4 men were accused of terrorism and they were planning to plant ricin bombs or something like that. And at the time, I remember watching that news report and seeing it in the Sun and thinking, oh, like, how terrible, I'm glad they got caught. Only to find out later that was a huge smear campaign and a huge injustice done to those men long afterwards as well. So they end up having to say this all the time. But, you know, we get the same old lessons learned lines that you get whenever these big stories come to light and you realise that they've just lied their whole way through it. They had another one about a Muslim bus driver who they falsely claimed that while he was working, he kicked the passengers off the bus, according to this very fake story, to pray to Allah. Actually, that was a pack of lies. What had happened is, after he'd finished working, he'd gone to the bus garage and prayed then, but somebody, some mysterious person had taken pictures of that, and the Sun spun it into this big story about him kicking passengers, kicking elderly people off the bus, and, you know, being a big inconvenience to everyone. That man, Arun, as his name was, won £30,000 worth of damages from the Sun, and the Daily Mail ran the exact same story a year later, alluding to the same man, the same time period, even though it was proven to be fake in court. And yet another example, the Levison inquiry, which came about because of the phone hacking scandal. One book I'd really like to recommend to people, I was reading it on the way up actually, called Fake Shapes and Royal Trappings. I don't know if anybody's ever read that book or heard of it, but it's by Peter Burden, who really exposes some of the grubby and downright dirty practices, particularly within tabloid journalism, but increasingly with broadsheets as well, as they get more kind of celebrity focus. He's had reports of journalists taking indecent pictures of themselves and pretending that it was taken at a celebrity party or in their house or something like that. He's had cases where journalists have taken drugs or enticed other people to take drugs in order to set them up. Especially politicians and celebrities, you get all these celebrity drug stories. What they don't tell you is that the so-called reporter with them was also taking drugs and had supplied the drugs, in fact. You get cases where people have slept with prostitutes and then sort of blamed the prostitute and done a big story about that. I'm not quite sure how that ties into journalism or relates to it in any way, shape or form, but this is what the media has been reduced to. It's basically a circus. So why is this going on, and you know, what causes a lot of people to act this way and take up these careers which really aren't informing people at all? Well, the problem is ownership. There's a real agenda behind it, definitely. It's a divide and rule agenda. It's to get you thinking on the irrelevant things, the trivia, instead of the big things that could really inspire people and question people to make a change. Right now I'm going to show 3 videos which go into that. The first one gives you an idea of how the media manipulates opinion and how it's really used as a
It's a sobering fact that the hidden power structure of international finance has exerted tremendous influence over public opinion in this country through its virtual control of higher education and major segments of mass communications. The human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it is possible to control the input of the human mind, then no matter how intelligent a person may be, it's entirely possible to program what he will think. And yes, it's even possible to program people to laugh at the mere mention of the word conspiracy.
One of the topics that is taboo is any discussion whatsoever about shadow government. Now, 10 years ago in the early 90s, when people called in mainstream talk shows and brought up issues like the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission, in some cases there was one major talk show who proudly says he's got half of his brain tied behind his back, actually said on the radio that there was no such thing as the Council on Foreign Relations, and anybody brought that up was a conspiracy, wacko, kook, wingnut, etc., etc. Now we all know, of course, that the Council on Foreign Relations is a very real organization. It's been around for a long, long time.
The year is 1917. And Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. congressional record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar.